Good afternoon and welcome. This is the Doug and Fur Show. My name is Doug Petrozelli. This is my partner in truth. I am live with,
Fernando. Oh, that intro was
and
different than normal, huh?
yeah,
You had a
yeah,
couple words there.
yeah. Anyway, I just want to just talk about real quick before we get into today's topic, just our success that, we believe that God has blessed us with. We're working hard. We're working diligent. We've done 20 episodes. This is going to be episode number 21. We just hit over 1,000 followers on Instagram, 3,000 on Facebook. We're climbing on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. So if you're, want to listen to us on another, platform, please understand that's the Doug and Fur Show. Spotify, very easy to listen to, very easy to stop, pick back up right where you left off. Same with Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Easy to share on Instagram and Facebook and listen there as well if you like. But we just want to encourage that. We want to thank everybody that has been a part of this and has been willing to follow and be a part of this. So
Yeah,
we're
thanks
grateful for that.
everybody. Thank you so much. And actually, we've got to figure out what's going on with Apple Podcasts because they keep on delaying our posts. Maybe they don't like our content.
Maybe not, but we're not going to stop.
Yeah, we're gonna keep going. So thank you guys for watching. And if you want to send anybody our way, you think this is good content, feel free to do so. Just point them to our Instagram, our website, and the many other platforms that we have. So this is our regularly scheduled. So it's supposed to be on Tuesday, but since Monday was Labor Day, we got caught up yesterday. So we're doing it today on Wednesday. But this is our regular show that we normally do in front of a green screen and stuff. It's just we had to do it remotely today due to conflicting schedules and stuff like that. So that if it looks a little different, that's the reason. So why don't you
Right.
introduce our topic, Doug?
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about abortion and where our stance are, where and why our stance is what it is. And I do believe that I could speak for you. I think I'd speak for even most conservatives, most libertarians. We're very pro life. We believe that abortion is anything that stops a pregnancy, and we believe that life starts at conception. And we'll just talk a little bit. I think a good place to start is why we believe that.
Well, before we talk about that stuff, I just wanted to mention that the argument pro-life and pro-choice is a skewed. So just the word itself, pro-life, implies that the other side is pro-death, and then
Right.
the words pro-choice implies that the other side is like anti-choice. So
Right.
we're gonna have to break that down, the pro-life and pro-choice. We're gonna have to break down that what it actually means.
Right.
Um, and I know it might sound strange, this topic coming from two men, right? It's like, okay, well, what do you guys know, right? So it would have been nice to have someone on here that could probably understand that a little bit better, or that could offer a differing point of view. So if you're out there and you're listening to this and you want to talk about this, we would be glad to do another episode with you on it. So if you feel like you have something good to contribute to this conversation, feel free to reach out to us and we'll do another episode on this. Um,
Right.
but yeah, but definitely, I think that just because we're men, it doesn't take away from the validity of our points that we're about to
Right.
share. So our points are we're going to share it from an objective point of view, not from like, oh, we don't care because we're men. Uh, so
Right.
so why don't you go ahead and tell me why it is that you believe in pro-life?
Right. So I believe the government is responsible for three things and three things alone. The protection of our rights, and I boil down the rights are that I have the right to life. You're not allowed to kill me. Liberty. You're not allowed to enslave me or force me to. I'm allowed to bargain for my own labor. If you want to pay me, I can choose to or not to. You're not allowed to enslave me. And to property. You're not allowed to steal my stuff. And I believe that everybody has those rights, and my right ends where it starts to inflict and encroach upon your rights. And I do believe that is, the lens in which I read the Constitution, the lens in which I believe the government has a responsibility to protect. And I do believe that when it comes to abortion, it falls under life, the protection of life. I do believe that life starts at conception. And for anybody that doesn't understand that, it's very simply the second the sperm hits the egg, that becomes its own individual DNA. That's not a part of the mother. That is its own individual DNA. And I do believe that life has rights, and I do believe it should be protected. I don't think that it becoming born, the 9-inch birth canal, which some people say it's all the way up to this point of birth. Some people even have, New York has a law that says that if the abortion fails, you can just allow that baby to die on the table after it's already out of the mother. I don't understand how another human being could see another human being and just allow that to happen and not stop that to see that. You're actually seeing it at that point. Um, so when we take it to that point, I don't think anybody has the right to take another person's life. Unless we're getting into the argument of the death penalty in which somebody has already taken another person's life. That being said, an innocent life, I believe, has no right to be taken. And I do believe that abortion is murder. I know that sounds very harsh. I know that's not for me to make a judgment on anybody. I am no one to judge as far as the validity of your human being, but I am called to judge actions just as much as I would judge a rapist, a bank robber, or somebody who murdered. In the sense of murder that we would all agree on murder is. I believe this is the same thing. I do believe it's evil. Um, I'm not here to, make anybody feel bad about this. And I do my best to approach this with a sense of, I'm not sure to bash somebody, but I do have to be very clear that this is what it is, and it is a life. And if abortion does happen, it is a life that has stopped, a life that has ended, and I can't see that as anything other than murder.
Okay. Um, so the reason we chose this topic is because of the recent abortion laws that were passed in Texas, and it's a hot topic, right? And we've been wanting to
Right,
talk about this for a while. So what better time? So
right,
I wanted to start by just talking about where this disagreement lies. I think it's so important that to understand the other side is where
right,
is the disagreement? Why do we disagree? Because what I hear thrown around all the time is, from the conservative standpoint, is, well, you're killing a baby, you're
right,
a baby murderer, and if the other side, if pro-choicers really did believe that they were murdering a baby, they wouldn't do it. I mean,
right,
the majority of people don't agree with murdering babies. Nobody's gonna go
right,
and stab a 9-month-old baby in the face.
right,
It's just not it's not something that people do. Like any good person believes this. So obviously, in their eyes, a pro-choicer is not murdering a baby. Okay, so I do recognize that that is what they believe. They don't
right,
believe that it's a life. And so from a pro-choicer's point of view, a pro-lifer is taking away a woman's right to choose. It's like,
right,
well, why are you going to take that choice away from me? Like it's my right to choose whether I want to have the baby or not,
right,
right? So that's the argument that they see. And our counter to that is, well, it's not that it's your choice, it's the baby's choice, right?
right,
It's not your choice to decide on whether you want to have the baby or not. It's the baby's choice on whether they want to
right,
live or not, and you're not giving them that choice. You're killing them.
right,
So if we look at these arguments, I think it's pretty clear to see that the disagreement happens on where life begins,
right,
right? Because if life begins at conception, and if a pro-choicer says, okay, life begins at conception, then they're killing a baby.
right,
And if a pro-lifer agrees, like, all right, well, life begins at birth. Like if me and you
right,
just decide to agree, like, all right, life begins at birth, then we really
right,
are taking away a woman's right to choose, right? So now at this point, we have to say, where does life begin?
right,
And that's where the disagreement lies. I believe it
right,
begins at conception. Some people believe it begins when there's a heartbeat, when there's brain function, and some people believe that it begins when the baby is birthed. That's when life
right,
begins. That's when your birthday is, etc. Right?
right,
So I think it's important to not dehumanize the other side by saying you're murdering babies or you're taking away a woman's right to choose, because you have to understand where their belief comes from. So
right,
instead of tackling the argument by yelling at each other and saying you baby murderer,
right,
or you believe in freedom and here you're taking away my freedom, why don't we discuss the actual disagreement, which is the
right,
definition of life?
right,
I think that's where we can get into it. So if we can prove, or if we can scientifically approach life, then we can have a deeper understanding. And who knows, maybe some people might flip sides.
right,
Um, okay, so that being said, I am not by any means a biologist or an evolutionary scientist or anything like that, a geneticist. So I might have some wrong information when it comes to this. So if you want to correct me or Doug, just let us know. Just reach out and give us some facts, you know.
Yes,
Um,
please.
so I'll go ahead and I'll tell you why I think that life begins at conception, right? One of the biggest reasons that pro-lifers believe that life begins at conception is the religious people. So like
Right.
myself, right? I'm a Christian and I believe life begins at conception because
Right.
that's what the Bible tells me. That's what God says that He
Right.
knit me in my mother's womb, right? So
Right.
basically, before I was born, He already knew what He had
Right.
for me. So if you are not a Christian, then it's not fair for me to force my belief on you. So I can't say,
Right.
well, you have to be a pro-lifer because God says a life begins at conception.
Right.
I have to find another argument, right?
Right.
And that if you are a Christian that is a pro-choicer, well, then I can go ahead and dismantle your argument right there. Life begins at conception because God says so. And if you have some counter Bible verses you'd like to throw our way, then go ahead and share those with us. But I think for the most part, the Bible pretty clearly aligns with God always having a plan for your life and that happening before you're even born. So if you're
Right.
a Christian that truly and fully believes in the Bible, but you still believe in pro-choice, then I would ask you to look at the Bible and look at those arguments again, because according to God, it clearly begins at conception. But if you are not a Christian and you don't necessarily believe everything the Bible says or whatever, or even that God is real or anything like that, then now we have to approach the topic of the definition of life a little bit differently.
Right.
So I'll pass it over to you and you tell me why you think that life begins at conception from a scientific approach.
Right. So, from my understanding, what would separate me from you? I have a different DNA. I have different. Um, Basically, we just break it down to DNA. I have my own individual DNA. I have my own individual chromosomes. And where did that start first? And that does start at conception. It is my own individual DNA. My parents, the second the sperm hit the egg, that DNA that I have in me right now, and that DNA that will be with me till the day I die, that started there at conception. It was individual, it was independent. Um, and yes, there was a dependency on the womb of my mother for me to, survive and get to the point of development where I could live outside the womb. But if we just go into an argument of dependence, I mean, I would say I was very utterly dependently on my mother, probably until, the first year. I was probably just as dependent as I was in the womb, just as much as anybody who was born. I would say the first year you are fully dependent for every little thing, just as much as you are in the womb. And I think that you become less and less, hopefully you become less and less as time goes on. And I don't think the argument of being dependent really means something. There's people right now that are on ventilators, or people that never ever did develop out of medical dependency from the time they're born, or people in car accidents that get to a place where they're essentially a vegetable, or they're in a coma. They're completely dependent. I'm not allowed to go into the hospital and cut their throats. That's not okay for me to do. Um, and I'm just very, very convinced that the second it is DNA, in its own individual DNA, that being has rights, and I believe that every human being is inherently valuable, more valuable than any treasure on earth, more valuable than anything. I believe that the human being is the most valuable thing that we have here on this earth, and I don't believe that any rights, human rights, I believe there are human rights, life, liberty, and property. I don't think that those should be violated in any way, shape, or form. And I go down to DNA.
Yeah.
Otherwise, at what point do I start to draw the line? Where is that line drawn? Um, you know, is it drawn once I'm, outside of the womb? Well, I don't know. I can't make that argument that the 6 inches of birth canal makes me a human or not a human. What if I didn't come out of the birth canal? What if I was a C-section
C-section
baby?
or whatever, yeah.
What if I was born 3 months premature? At that point, a 6 month pregnancy, you could say could be aborted, but the baby coming out 3 months earlier, and basically be the equivalent of a 6 month pregnancy coming out, that wouldn't be okay. So I can't make that. Anybody who tries to explain to me and says that 6 inches of birth canal means something or another, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I can't rationally accept that. There's no science behind that. So to me, it comes down to, where do I draw the line? And I draw the line at DNA.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a good point because for a long time we didn't even know about DNA
right,
for like much of human history, and back then some cultures practiced like after the baby was born, if it had defects or anything like that, they would kill it.
right,
So I think most of us would agree that that's murder. Once a
right,
baby's born, I think most people agree that once a baby's born, it is life. Um,
right.
some people agree that it begins even before that. So let me try switching over to a desktop view. Let me see if it still works so that I can show you guys something. Can you guys hear myself and Doug still?
I mean,
Doug,
I
go.
can hear you.
Okay, okay, cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and show this here. Uh,
I cannot see it, just so you know. I don't know if the audience can see it, but I
Yeah, no,
cannot.
actually, it's becoming a little too complicated. I'll set it up for next time. But basically, what I was showing was that the definition of, or not the definition, but when the actual DNA becomes independent. So what Doug was saying, I was going to show some scientific proof from that from MedlinePlus.gov, and it says that when the single sperm enters the egg, conception occurs. The combined sperm and egg is called a zygote, and the zygote contains all of the genetic information, DNA, needed to become the baby. Right. So we're talking about the DNA being the actual basis for life, right? But if you look at one counter argument is the fact that your individual cells contain DNA, right? And your cells die
Right,
all the time.
right,
So, for example, if you get an amputation, is that murder, right?
right,
Because you're essentially killing cells that contain your DNA.
right,
So the definition of life can get really complicated now that
right.
we have a more profound understanding of science, right? Um, so you can talk about, well, it begins when it has a heartbeat, right? Well, what
Right,
about people whose hearts have stopped beating and we bring them back, right?
right,
Um, well, it begins when you have normal brain development, right? Well, what about people that are basically vegetables, like you said. Some of them
right,
are even brain dead, but then they can be brought back. Now, this is very
right,
rare, but I believe it does happen. If I'm wrong, go ahead and let me know. Lucian OBRS says hi. I'll just respond here, hi.
right.
Um, so when you start
Well, I want to
looking,
just touch real quick on the brain development. Even if we say, active, fully functional brain development, then at what point do we draw the line? Because brain development is a spectrum. There are people who are, on the IQ range, geniuses, and then there would be people who are mentally disabled. Um, where is fully functional brain development? Where, at what point do you draw that line?
yeah, well, some people can say, well, like before the brain even exists, right? Because at the moment of conception, there's no brain. It's just
Right,
a sperm and an egg that have been combined to create a zygote. Then it starts replicating, right?
right.
From what I look at here is usually at the seventh week of pregnancy, the brain and the face are the focus of development. So before that, there is no brain, right?
Well, there are brain waves, I believe, 2 weeks after conception. Brain
Okay.
waves. So it's
Okay.
not
So
development, but there are brain waves. So then we could even get into the argument, well, what is the brain and when does the brain,
yeah,
when
that's
is it
that's
developed as a brain even? So it does get complicated.
yeah, exactly. That's pretty good. But then you can argue that before 2 weeks, it's not a life, so abortion would be
Right,
okay, right? So um, it gets very tricky. I think if you believe in the concept of a soul and things like that, right,
right,
then life doesn't exist at the brain. Your brain is simply the control center,
right,
but and the soul dwells within you, but essentially in your brain. Obviously, when you go brain dead, or if you don't have a brain anymore, there is no like life as you know it. You don't have
right,
that consciousness, right? What we call a conscious reasoning or a conscious brain, right? So However, if you don't believe in the concept of a soul, I think the majority of people that don't believe in a soul, they believe that life exists in a brain. That life is simply consciousness and
Right.
awareness of your own life. Like I am aware that I'm alive and I'm aware of my own consciousness, therefore I'm a reasonable and aware human being. That's life. And as soon as that
Right.
gets taken away, like if you cut a certain portion of my brain or take that away, I'm no longer alive. But that's a very tricky argument because I can go into a coma and not be aware that I'm alive, but I'm still technically alive,
Right.
right?
Or I can also fall asleep and am I really aware
Yeah, and now
when I'm
you're in
sleeping?
exactly, and now you're like in you get into your subconscious. It's very, very tricky.
Right.
So I'd say I'm willing to accept the fact that I'm willing to accept the argument from a secular point of view that before a brain is developed, you don't believe that it's a life. So that's about as far as I'm willing to accept. I personally believe it begins at conception because of my
Right.
personal religious beliefs, right?
Right.
But if you don't believe in that, I think as far as I'm willing to accept, like I just said, is the argument that it begins when you have a brain. So I think
Right.
that's about as far as I'd be willing to admit. But anything after that, I think that we should start being more clear with our definition of life. We shouldn't start getting too tricky with the heartbeat and the development because the complications that and contradictions that happen just get so deep that I think it's
Right.
just a lot easier and a lot more consistent to say that it happens when there's a brain.
Right.
So or brain waves even.
Right.
What do
And
you?
I would even say that that would be, an argument or a push or compromise. Yeah, I hate to say compromise because it is human life. Um, but I would even be willing to take that risk of compromise because if brain waves start to come into effect 2 weeks after conception, no one's going to really know that they're pregnant, within that time frame.
Yeah, but that
So
would
I mean,
just
that would be something that I would be even willing to, to go ahead and say, well, why don't we make a law that says, once there's brainwaves developed, and then
yeah.
abortions are illegal, and then that would essentially outlaw all abortions. I mean, you'd really have to go out of your way to make sure. You literally have to try to conceive and then monitor yourself every single day, and really have to go out of your way, and that would be
Yeah, but according
a level of disturbance that I think you'd have other issues if that's what you really wanted to do.
if the government did adopt this definition of it beginning when there's brain waves, so if they just set a hard date of 2 weeks after conception, right, then it would
Right,
not outlaw Plan B or the
right,
morning after pill, right? If
right,
the government said life begins at conception, then essentially Plan B or morning after pill would be murder and it would be considered an abortion. So that's
right,
that's I think that's a compromise that I'd be willing to make, not from a religious standpoint, but
right,
from the United States Constitution declaring that there's a
right,
freedom of religion.
right,
That's about as far as I'd be willing to go, which would be the morning after
right,
pill, which I personally wouldn't, or I don't think I would. I mean, I've never been faced with that situation, but according to my moral and religious beliefs, I
right,
wouldn't. But if someone who is not particularly religious in this sense would want to
right,
do it, that's a person that I wouldn't judge. I wouldn't say, hey, you're murdering babies, right? So, but anything
right,
else after that, I think that the best and safest way to go is to just define life at the
right,
beginning of brainwaves. I think it's the simplest way to go, and that's the point that we can debate. But the whole
right,
pro-choice and pro-life thing, I think we should just
right,
put that to rest. Like
right,
from my eyes, I'm not taking away a woman's right to choose. I'm giving the baby's right to choose life.
right,
Yeah.
absolutely,
So stop saying that I'm taking away a woman's right to choose. And I'm going to
right,
stop saying that you're murdering babies because you don't believe you're murdering babies.
right,
You believe that it's not a baby yet. So let's just
right,
tackle the definition of life. Let's get
right.
straight to that.
Right. And another part of this topic I wanted to bring up is, why do most people, what's the leading argument as to why somebody would want an abortion? And the argument I always bring up, or I always get brought to me, like, what about rape and what about incest? And I want to know what your thoughts on that are.
Well, again, I think that can easily be answered if we just define what life is, right?
Right.
So, if we can't agree where life is and life begins or life begins at birth or like after birth or whatever,
Right.
then you can make the arguments for rape and incest. But if life begins at conception or at the 2 weeks or
Right.
whatever,
Right.
abortion would still be wrong because you're still murdering a baby for the sake of
Right.
someone else's crime, right?
Right.
Like if I go and rob a liquor store, you're not gonna murder someone else just because I robbed the liquor store, right?
Right.
You're not gonna murder a bystander or someone who's innocent as a punishment. That's essentially that's a sacrifice, right?
Right.
So you have to punish the rapist and
Right.
whoever committed the
Absolutely.
crime, but not the baby. It just
Right.
depends on what we define as life. What is
Right.
life? So
Absolutely.
I think that definition of life clearly
Right.
dispels all the arguments for rape and
Right.
incest.
And just to put it out there real quick from a biblical standpoint, any laws that men were to create for other men biblically, the sins of one man were never meant to be dealt upon the children or the offspring. Yes, there are scriptures where God does decide to do that in certain circumstances where the sins of the father do meet the offspring, but that is a very specific of God doing that under certain circumstances. Under the New Testament, that's not the case anymore. But as throughout the Bible is consistently consistent in the sins of the father not being held up against his children. And so I just want to make a point that very biblically that is extremely sound. And I think that from a moral standpoint, I don't think that anybody believes that if I murder somebody, that my son should have to go to jail for it. If I
Yeah.
rob a bank, my son should have to pay it back. That's not the case.
Well, one argument that I hear a lot is like, well, if you're pro-life, then how come you're pro-death sentence, right? Like you're
Right,
essentially taking someone else's life. I gotta say that I used to be pro capital punishment for a long time.
right,
For a little while, I think I've given some way to the middle ground after being presented some facts and some arguments within moral reasoning in
right,
Christianity. And I think I'm willing to concede some points. That would be an argument for when we do an episode on capital punishment.
right,
But essentially, what I'm saying is I'm not trying to use myself as a gold standard or a moral example or anything like that, but I will say that I was open-minded for a long time. I was like capital punishment is allowed, whatever, it's good, and I was open-minded to an argument from the other side, and they presented me with facts, and I just like listened, and I was like, well, it's reasonable. What they're saying is logically sound, so I'm going to
right,
consider that. So one day we'll talk about that, but
right,
but yeah, I'd encourage you to do the same, right? If you're on
right,
the other side of the fence and if you're pro-choice, right, and the arguments that we're presenting here make sense to you, then just be open-minded and be willing to say, you know what, maybe maybe I've had this twisted the whole time and what they're saying makes sense and there's nothing wrong with me being wrong and accepting that. Let me consider that other side and if I have to change opinions then I will. That's what I call personal growth. And I
right,
think that we should all be open to that. A lot of times we're so stubborn and set in our ways where we're just like we find a counter argument to everything that's given to us and sometimes it doesn't make sense and I think we should just be open to facts and reason.
right. Absolutely. And another part of that argument of rape and incest, as a result of abortions from rape and incest are 1% or less of all abortions are due to rape and incest. Most people are getting abortions out of a convenience or they don't think that they can economically afford them. And, I hear the argument that says, oh, well, do you want children to grow up poor? No, of course not. I don't want them to grow up poor. But if there's a poor child right now that is living and suffering and having just a life that is very difficult, my reaction is not I should go put a bullet in his head. Like, no,
Exactly.
that's
I'm
terrible.
gonna
That's
kill someone
absolutely
because they're
terrible.
poor, right? This is a
Right,
purge.
exactly. And I don't think that that's the answer. And I do believe that that child is just as valuable at 5 years old and just as precious. And I do want to create a world where there is less suffering, but I don't think that murdering off the suffering is the answer.
Yeah, I mean, just think of this, right? If you're using the pro rape and pro incest argument, pretend that as soon as conception happens, the baby is instantly and miraculously born. Um, you're God forbid you were raped or you were a product or you were a victim to incest or anything like that.
Right,
Um, just raped like an unwanted pregnancy in that sense, right? You were raped and the baby was immediately placed right in front of you. Would
right,
you kill it because well I was raped? right? Would you kill it? Would that be fair? Would that be morally justified? And I'd argue to say that most people would say no, it's not. It's a life you're murdering, right?
Right.
And it just goes back down to that definition of life. If we define life at the beginning of the brainwave activity, then it's still murder,
Right.
regardless of whether it was rape or not. It's still murder.
Right.
So just take a look at that argument there.
Right, absolutely, and I do know stories. When it comes to the idea of somebody that was struggling with abortion, I don't think I know I've not personally met anybody, and I'd be very hard pressed to know somebody that was in a dire circumstances where whatever they didn't have the money, they were no longer with the father, and they were struggling with this idea of should I get an abortion or should I not get an abortion. I have never met somebody who had the child and then thought, man, I wish I would have gotten the abortion.
Yeah,
I'd be very hard pressed to
that's
believe
true.
that anybody actually feels that way. And I will say that a large majority of women who do get abortions, even though they were in hard circumstances, do deal with regret, and do deal with suffering. And the whole point is, if it's not a life, then why are you dealing with regret? Why are you dealing with suffering? It's
Yeah,
because we inherently do know that it is self-evident to us in the beings of us, and this goes into the idea that I do believe it's God's world, and He did create us. We can't get away from that. You can't get away from that idea. That we inherently and self-evidently know that it is human life, and
yeah,
that's why it is a difficult decision, even for people who don't think it's life, even people who are not religious. It's politicians say, oh, it's a difficult decision for women. Well, why is it difficult if you really don't believe it's life? And
yeah,
the point is that you could say it's life, it's not life all you want, but it's self-evident to us. Every sense of our being understands that it is life,
yeah,
and we
yeah.
can't get away from it because it's God's world. And I
And,
know that that's going down the religious belief system, and that's not necessarily what this show is about. It's not necessarily a Christian show. It's fundamentals. We are believers, and we want to have facts and logic,
but
but we
but
can't get away from that point.
let me I mean, you said the whole thing about it being a religious argument, but I'll approach it from a worldly argument, from a secular point of view, right? So if so from an evolutionary perspective, I think that we inherently believe that it's life because it's beneficial to us. It allows for natural selection to pick the fittest person. If we don't believe that a pregnancy is life, then that would not be naturally selected. That trait would not be naturally selected to continue to be passed on. In fact, the fact
Right.
that we place so much value on a pregnancy is the reason why we inherently believe that it's life. And I think that that's why it's inherently embedded in us, and that's why it's a difficult
Right.
decision. And I would be pretty willing to bet that the majority of women considering abortions are justifying it inside their minds. They're saying, oh, it's not a life, whatever, and they're saying all these arguments inside their mind to justify this abortion so that they don't feel as guilty about it because they inherently deep down know that it is a life and that it essentially is murder. I think that's the
Right.
majority of women. I'm not saying that's everyone. Some people
Right.
truly don't believe that it's life, and there are exceptions to everything.
Right.
Strictly speaking, in averages here.
Right.
I also do want to recognize the fact, I know I said this the first time, but I'm saying it again, that we are men. I've never been in a situation where I have an unwanted pregnancy and
Right.
have considered abortion, right? And I never will be. So if you are a woman considering an abortion, I'm sad to say that I can't relate with you literally because I'm not in that position, and I'm sorry that I cannot relate with you and be able to help you through that in
Right.
that relational sense. But I believe the arguments we're presenting today are objective and unbiased in the sense that it's strictly
Right.
based on facts and not feelings or anything like that. So the facts that we're presenting are facts regardless of whether we're women or not, or we're considering abortions or not. The simple definitions of life that we're given are just straight up objective. They have nothing to do with our biological genders or anything like
Right.
that. So
Right. And and I think we're about to close off. I don't know if you had anything else to say, um, but there was one thing I wanted to end with, if you felt like you were done, and this is more anecdotal
anecdotal.
evidence. So this is personal experience, and I don't typically like to go off personal experience because I think that that's not sufficient. I think that we go the broader spectrum. But to any woman out there who is, struggling with that idea and with that thought, I do want you to know that I think that that life is worth living. And I say that as a person that I do believe my life is worth living. And, my experience is that my mother, was got pregnant at 18 years old, and was no longer with uh, my biological father at that point. And I know that that was a deep struggle, and she shared that with me. There was a deep struggle in her heart whether to have me or not. And I just have to say that I am so grateful that she's chosen life. I've been able to lead and live a great life. I've been able to travel to many countries. My mom ended up meeting a wonderful man who raised me, who is my dad to this day and adopted me, and I don't know him as anything else. And I got to be raised in an amazing family.
Mm-hmm.
I got to write books, and I've had even one published, and I've been able to preach the gospel to literally thousands of people in the past. I'm doing a podcast right now, and there's a big future, even far beyond. And I just want to say that I believe that this life of mine is worth living, and
Yeah.
I'm so grateful she made that choice in the midst of a situation that seemed helpless, where she, you know, was barely out of high school, didn't have a deep level
Mm-hmm.
education, didn't have the money, didn't have the resources, didn't have the finances. Everything pointed that it would be better. I think everybody on the secular worldview would say it would be so much better for this child to not be here, and I'm so thankful that I am here. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to, that was something that was on my heart to share for anybody who is struggling with it. There is a place of sympathy, but I do believe life is worth living,
Yeah,
even in the midst of trial.
and I think your life would be worth living regardless of whether it was an unwanted pregnancy or a product of rape. I mean,
Right, right.
if
And
God
it wasn't a
forbid,
product of rape. This was not a product. I
thank
just want
God,
to be clear about that.
but
Right, it
even
was
if it
not.
was, your life is still worth living. I mean, look at the
Right,
person you are
absolutely.
today. Imagine if her excuse was, "Oh, I was raped, so I'm just going to have this
Right,
abortion," and your life and all the wonderful things you've accomplished would have never happened.
right.
There's a song by one of my favorite bands. The band is called Yellow Card. The song is
Yeah.
called 10, and I cried when I heard it. And I don't know, I don't think I've ever cried at a song, but I credit that one. Um, and this is based on his real life. But he had an unwanted pregnancy with his girlfriend at the time when he was, I think he might have been like 18 or 21, like that. This is the lead singer of the band, and the song is called 10 because 10 years later he had deep regret for that abortion that they had. And the basis of the song is he's just singing like, "Oh, you would be 10 years old now and I'd be driving you to school and we'd be watching
Right,
Star Wars and you'd think I was cool," and that sort of thing. And it was just a very impactful song.
right.
I'd highly recommend it. It's called 10 by Yellow Card. So I'd highly recommend it, and hopefully it touches you the way it touched me. But yeah, I think that's all I have to say for today,
Right.
and probably one of
Yeah.
our more emotional episodes.
Yes, absolutely. But it was good. So we do want to thank everybody for joining in today. Please like and share this information, this video. Please, if you're not following us on our other platforms, it's much easier to listen. On Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube.
Yep.
Please like, share this content. We do truly appreciate. Thank you everybody who has contributed to this. And that's it. This
Yeah.
is the Doug and Fur Show.
All right. Signing off.